Welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. I hope you're having a great day. We're doing a show today that's going to have a lot of significance to coastal Mississippi, and we're going to actually run it a couple of times during the Christmas break because we really want people to hear what this show has to say, and you'll understand more, I think, as you listen to this. But I want you to listen to this show, take it in, share it with your friends. It'll be available on YouTube and Facebook through SuperTalk Mississippi or through the Ricky Matthews Show. You can go to your favorite podcast platform and it will be there. But this is one in a continuing conversation about where does coastal Mississippi go from here regionally. And I'm excited that we're in this moment, that we're having this conversation. And without giving you a big speech before we start it, I'm just going to go ahead and ask my friend Bill Cork, Executive Director of the Mississippi Development Authority, go ahead and join me. And we're going to kind of lay it all out. And for the next full show, we'll talk about as much as we possibly can. Nothing's off the table about, where we are as a state of Mississippi, how coastal Mississippi fits in, and what some of the opportunities might be for us going forward. Bill, thank you for taking some time to join me, my friend.
It was great to be with you, Ricky. Good to see you.
Hey, listen, I think a good place to start, we'll get to your letter in just a second, but I think a good place to start is maybe where my last column ended, and that is that you're a friend. You've spent time here. You've seen it from the inside in your role as the Executive Director for the Port and Harbor Commission in Hancock County. You're involved heavily in the Port of Gulfport, and for people who don't understand the connection between the Mississippi Development Authority and the Port of Gulfport, you can certainly talk about that. And you've been involved in the last 5 years as the MDA Executive Director in just about every project that has been announced or been engaged in some way or another here in coastal Mississippi. So I like to say you're one of us. So, but give us more. Help us understand that.
Well, Ricky, I've been doing economic development for 30 years. I did my graduate degree in urban and regional planning with an emphasis in economic development. I got that degree in 1994. And I have been at this game a very long time. I worked in multiple states before I came to Mississippi, where I've been here almost 10 years now. I spent about 10 years in Texas, and before that in Maryland and Virginia, in California, and overseas. So I have spent a lot of time building large-scale industrial development projects, working energy projects, and doing urban design in very distressed areas around the country. I worked on over 25 closing military bases, helping them get redeveloped, and worked a major economic redevelopment project at a former military base in Texas, over a 13,000-acre development. Okay. So, I've done this for a little bit, and I've been at the state now for 5 years, and it's been an absolute gift to be here working for Governor Reeves. And I've been to all 82 counties, Ricky. I've been to over 25 counties where I've met with boards of supervisors, economic development organizations, and done deep dives with them on their strategy and plans. And so I feel like I have a pretty good handle on both the state of the world of economic development and what's going on around Mississippi. And the legislature requires me once a year to weigh in on these Gulf Coast Restoration Fund projects. The governor expects me to have a mastery of what those things are, and also help advise him and Chris Wells on the Restore Act projects. I'm the co-chair of the Tourism and Economic Development Committee for Restore. I work with Joe Spraggins on the Go Mesa funds. So we are a whole of government approach trying to deploy capital on the coast and around the state to achieve the economic outcomes that we want for transformational growth in the state. And I don't think there's any doubt that under Governor Reeves' leadership, we've had record-breaking success doing just that. Very, very lucky to be here.
Well, look, one of the things that I have written about, and we're going to get to your letter here in just a second, but I just want to kind of lay a little bit of groundwork. There's no way to avoid the reality that the worst natural disaster in American history hit coastal Mississippi. Katrina was beyond one for the ages. And our recovery from that, the way that we have mastered spending federal money and private sector money. I always make sure I mention the private sector, because the reality is, as Governor Barber said so many times, The federal government is going to help you get back on your knees, but it's private investments going to help you get back on your feet. And they had to work together. The government role is going to be helping with infrastructure, et cetera, all these things that are important. But, getting the casinos back open again and getting Ingalls back open again and getting Chevron back open again and all these, incredibly important businesses that make the coastal Mississippi economy thrive, getting them back open, getting population back here, getting schools back up, the whole story around our recovery, which is incredibly well documented in Haley Barbour's book, America's Great Storm, which I had the opportunity to write the foreword to, is a case study on leadership. What happened in Washington while all this was happening and what happened here while all this is happening. I think it should be required reading for any leader in coastal Mississippi, period. It should be. And if you haven't read it, then you don't have a perspective about it. And one of the things I worry about, in fact, is we have a lot of new leaders in this community that don't have that, that background and that institutional knowledge. And I think it's critical to understanding sort of where we are. And by the way, what we're capable of doing when our backs are against the wall and in this fundamentally historic way, something I point out often. But because of that, for 20 years, we've been in kind of a recovery mode. That's not to say that Ingalls wasn't doing incredible things and Chevron wasn't doing incredible things and we weren't building ancillary and that we weren't seeing new opportunities arrive at Stennis. I'm not saying that at all. But the point that I'm making, and I think it's an important contrast, is that during the 20 years that we were involved in recovery and getting sort of the basis of our economy back running again, places like the Golden Triangle were doing $11 billion in new growth. So we weren't really focused on that. So one of the things I've maintained is that we've got to find a way to shift the gears from what has been, I don't want to say an entirely recovery economy because that's not fair to say it that way, but you get the point that I'm making, that we've got to shift gears and start really thinking about the future, because during that 20 years, a lot of things have changed. AI, this onshoring move that's happening, and advanced manufacturing has taken it to the next level. Robotics has come on. I mean, I could just go on and on and on about all of the possibilities that have changed since Katrina hit. But it is an important differentiating factor. And we're kind of, would you actually see coastal Mississippi that being sort of at a turning point, that we're at a moment now where we can begin to shift the gears to think more broadly about building new stuff like you're involved in other parts of the state? Talk about that just a little bit.
Well, Ricky, I think, in general, I would concur with your overall assessment that we're out of recovery mode and moving into the next generation of the life cycle of the coast. I came to Mississippi 10 years ago. 2016 is when I showed up here, and already at that time, the Hancock County Port and Harbor Commission had received a grant from the Economic Development Administration to start strategic planning to take the post-recovery environment and move it into the next generation. And I helped, working with the staff, we helped perfect that plan and turn it into our aviation and aerospace master plan, which led to the development of the Pearl River Community College Aerospace and Aviation Academy. It led to the landing, maintenance, repair, and overhaul activities for the federal government, major aerospace jobs at Stennis Airport. And I was just down last week with the governor, and we cut the ribbon on a new state-of-the-art technical facility in what they're calling Ignition Park, which was part of my original master plan for that site. But over the last 5 years, they've assembled the money and got themselves into a position to make that work. And Blaine LaFontaine has done a fantastic job. In fact, I think, to quote the governor, he said, Hancock County is kicking ass and taking names. And that's because 10 years ago, we started the process of thinking transformationally about how to reimagine Hancock County's future, and started systematically going about the business of assembling the resources. Now, that vision was more complicated by the way the funding for those projects was done. So let me give you an example. On the Ignition Park that they just announced last week and cut the ribbon on, that was an $11 million investment. But we had to go, the local community had to go through about 4 different rounds of funding iteration to put that funding together. They had to stitch together site development grants, restore funding, GCRF funding, and local match. And it took them forever to work through the year-long process of applying for all this money, not getting the full funding for the project, having to go back the next year and apply again. That park could have been built 4 or 5 years ago had the vision of the coast said Ignition Park is a priority. Let's fund the first phase. Same with the Pearl River Community College, the only county on the coast not to have a real permanent bricks and mortar community college campus in the post-Katrina era. It took 7 years for Adam Breerwood and his predecessor to cobble together enough money to build that campus. Otherwise, it could have been done in producing talent 5 years ago. So this is not a question of a lack of vision by a lot of the local economic developers. You see the same thing happen in the Port of Pascagoula. They just came out with a new strategic plan for the port in Singing River Island. I'm meeting in January with John Nass at the Port of Gulfport to revisit their strategic plan. You have an amazing master plan going on at the airport, at Trent Lott, and at Gulfport. So, Ricky, there's vision. We just need to get a better solution for funding it.
I'm with you 100%. I think that these pockets of excellence are important to note, and we'll continue that part of the conversation with Bill Cork when we get back on the other side. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're visiting with Bill Cork, the Executive Director for the Mississippi Development Authority, and we're going to get to, in this segment, the letter that he wrote that I think was a wake-up call. It was, and the governor has chimed in as well, and it's not something that should be adversarial. It's something that should be, I think, a great opportunity, frankly, for us, as I pointed out at the beginning of the show, to begin the transition from what has been a really incredible recovery from Katrina into really defining what our future is going to be and ways that we might be able to go about that. One of the things I've often say on the show, I think in my conversation recently with Richard on his show at SuperTalk, Richard Cross, I referred to the crown jewels, and you think about I've previously referred to them as the bookends, but you've got Stennis Space Center on one end and all the blue chip industries that are part of that. And you've got Chevron and Ingalls and Bollinger that are a bookend in the Jackson County area with tourism and casinos and all that in between. We operate from a beautiful position of strength. We really do. Mm-hmm. But when you take a step back and start to think about where advanced manufacturing is headed, where AI is headed, where lots of things are headed, even the threats from the gaming to the gaming community, the proliferation of gaming across America, and the reality that we've got over 90,000 direct and indirect jobs in government. That's the military bases, et cetera, and gaming. That's clear. In shipbuilding, over 90,000 direct and indirect jobs. If we're not doing something to dramatically diversify that economy, then we're at risk. So we can't sit just with the crown jewels and be happy. And the point that I'm making, and I think a growing number of others see as well, certainly that's what you're saying, is that we've got to mint some new ones. And so probably this is a good place to maybe go back to your letter. And before you share the key components of your letter, explain the Gulf Coast Restoration Fund and the role that you have related to that.
Right. Well, the Gulf Coast Restoration Fund is a law, and it was passed by the legislature as a way to figure out how to allocate the annual distribution of funds from the settlement fund into this appropriation account. And it's different from the restore funding, which comes from the same settlement. But in the restore account, that runs through DEQ and has a variety of different buckets over there. And the governor has a discretionary bucket. So when we talk about restoration funds, you have to kind of distinguish between the restore program managed by DEQ and the GCRF program that's administered by MDA. The legislation is very, very clear that the legislature sets up a process by which they take recommendations and ultimately appropriate projects. And it's just like you think how a bill becomes a law from Schoolhouse Rock, right? MDA has been given the responsibility to recommend projects to the legislature every year. It's MDA's responsibility to recommend those projects to the legislature. Not just projects, but we can recommend programs. There's a whole provision in the law that allows for loan programs, loan guarantees, and grants that can be given to everybody from public bodies to for-profits and nonprofits. Okay, so MDA has a responsibility under the law to open a portal, seek public input. That input then is presented to MDA, and we score them. Okay, we score them based on the almost 24 criteria that are in the law. They get a score. We stack rank those scores based on a committee review we do internally. And then we send that package to the Gulf Coast Restoration Advisory Council. And that's chaired by Jamie Miller. And they have appointees by the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker to advise MDA. That advisory committee is not an advisory committee to the legislature. That advisory committee is an advisory committee to MDA. MDA is the executive branch agency that holds the final responsibility for recommending projects and or programs to the legislature. Okay. Now, every year that process works. And when people talk about my, they need to realize is that my letter this year was 103 pages long. Okay. It wasn't what you saw on TV or that people are talking about. It was a cover letter to a series of documents that included the raw score sheets for every single project we took into the portal and a ranking of those by score, and then the results of the Gulf Coast Restoration Advisory Council, the advisory committee scoring. Then I took all that and I made recommendations. And that's the process. Now the legislature can do what it has done before, accept some, reject some, appropriate their own projects, just not appropriate anything, which is what they've done for the last 2 years. And my recommendations are only worth the paper they're written on, because at the end of the day, the legislature appropriates the money, MDA and through the executive branch agencies then execute whatever the governor signs off on.
So before Ashley Edwards was the executive director, CEO for the Gulf Coast Business Council, he also served as chairman of the Gulf Coast Restoration Fund Advisory Board. And then more recently, you mentioned Jamie Miller's name as the current chair of the advisory board. He also serves as the executive director for the Gulf Coast Business Council. You go back in history of the Gulf Coast Business Council, they in 2019 commissioned a study, like $100,000 plus they spent to try to help define where the money can go. And as you and I discussed a little bit before the break, before the show started, what this plan came up with is essentially 5 guideposts. There's just 5, so I'll mention them: economic competitiveness, quality of place, regional collaboration, innovation, strategic and resilient infrastructure. Those basically summarize the points that were made in the legislation itself, and we got to where we're using the term transformation. We want a transformational project. What I have learned in my 5 years of talking about this, like I've said many times, when I look at I think we've had moments where we've made some progress, and then we didn't make progress. Initially, we did way too much small ball, and I said that it had become a bit of a political football for local legislators. But at the end of the day, this plan that the Business Council put together, they even touted even today, there's nothing binding about it. It's not literally a plan per se, but more guideposts for how to spend the money. And I think the point is that there's been a lot of effort in this complex place we call coastal Mississippi, and all these various entities and political subdivisions and all these hands in the cookie jar. We've worked really hard to try to figure out how to best spend the money. So the effort is there. You know that, and I know that. The board means well. Jamie's leadership of that effort is to be commended. Everyone has their hearts and their minds in the right place. But the system, the way it's set up, the legislation, the way it's set up, it kind of dooms us to local patches of fragmented investment as opposed to a unified engine working to make decisions within the context of some master plan that's going to take us to this new diversified economic place that you and I talked about in the first segment. So the good intentions are there. You see that. It's just that there's a moment in time we all got to come to grips with this fragmentation isn't going to get us where we need to be. Very few communities have hundreds of millions of dollars available to them to be able to do what we had this opportunity to do. And while we spent a lot of money, we got a lot of money yet to spend. And your moment, your letter, and this calling was not to be adversarial, but was to say, take a step back, everybody. This is our moment. Isn't that essentially what you were doing?
It's exactly what I was doing, but let me just make it even simpler for your listeners, Ricky. I mean, at the end of the day, I serve the governor of the state of Mississippi, and he has a fiduciary responsibility, as well as I do by the statutes, to sign grant agreements or to make recommendations to the legislature. We're where the rubber meets the road. This Hunger Games style competition for resources that occurs on the coast is an entertaining discussion for news media pundits and everything. But at the end of the day, I sit down across the table from the governor this time of year every year, and we lay out in front of him Go Mesa funding, Restore funding, site development grant funding, the Gulf Coast Restoration Funds, ARC up in Northeast Mississippi, Delta Regional Authority money, all the money that the governor has some influence over as the executive branch chief. And he has to decide, what am I going to approve? Okay. And the governor filters things really through a very simple lens. Where do I get the highest return on investment for this decision? How do I take people working in Mississippi, Mississippians and future Mississippians, and get them the highest paid, highest quality, family sustaining careers that I can get, so that we can then avoid having to pay public benefits to people who are in low wage, low skill jobs? That's the way Tate Reeves thinks about the problem. Okay. Now, I realize that the air conditioner repairs at the Long Beach City Hall or the sidewalk project in this community may be really super important to those communities. Okay. But when I come back and have to sit down across the table from the governor and ask him the question or answer the question, how does this generate new jobs? There are some projects that do that better than others. And so I'm not trying to call out anybody specifically, Ricky, here, because all the projects are noteworthy and important, but where's the highest ROI for the coast?
Yeah,
That's what we're trying to
I think the key is everybody's got to take a step back and say, where do we go from here in a way that's going to help this region win? And we can define that a bunch of different ways. The metrics are clear. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Bill Cork. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're having a deep conversation about coastal Mississippi economic future with Bill Cork, who is the executive director of the Mississippi Development Authority. Your letter was followed by Governor Tate Reeves joining Richard Cross at SuperTalk, where he essentially said all these same things, that this is not a controversial moment where we should be fighting. I mean, this is not that. This is about taking a step back and saying, okay, what's best? I think in some ways the legislation was flawed. I think the intentions of the legislation were terrific. But as I've discussed with some coastal legislators, it probably needs to be refined. And it could be refined in ways that could help us begin to establish where we want to go. I think one of the things I've been calling for is the need for a plan, a regional plan, one where there's tremendous buy-in. Then you think about, okay, if you were to develop a plan, what kind of organization should develop that plan? This comes back to the point that you were making. There are pockets of excellence all over coastal Mississippi. Jackson County Economic Development Foundation is doing some good work in pockets. Harrison County Development Commission is doing the same thing. You highlighted some of the ones that were happening at the Hancock County Port and Harbor Commission. We understand all those things are true. But in terms of a regional approach, bringing all those organizations, not doing away with them. They do great work. They land manage and get things ready, and they do perfect, important work in their communities. But from a regional point of view, create a foundation for conversations to take place that involve military bases and all of the airports. You mentioned those a few minutes ago. You think about the private sector and the public sector. We need to have something, and I call it an economic development alliance. We can call it whatever we want to call it, but there needs to be a plan within the context of something that gives us the chance for future money spending to make those decisions within the context of that. We don't have that. That's a big issue, isn't it?
Well, let me comment on two things you just mentioned. One is sort of the legislative, and I've heard you call this the GCRF 2.0, like we need some legislative tweaks. You know, Ricky, I heard you on the radio with Richard Cross the other day talking about this. So I literally pulled the legislation up before this call today to read it again. you know, that was a blood, sweat, and tears exercise, about 5 or 7 years ago, whenever they put that together. It's actually very capable of doing whatever we want to do within the context of the legislation. The legislators or you or others may advocate for some reforms, and I'd be eager to hear those. But we have the ability to do project-specific work like we're doing it now. The legislature could also appropriate a loan fund under Section 7 and Section 8 of the GCRF statute, administered by MDA, where they take applications on a continuous rolling basis, and we make these projects go on and on a lot faster, a lot easier, leveraging private capital and other things. That's already in the law. What I recommended in my letter for revolving loan funds is already enabled in the statute, and the regs have already been written at MDA. This is not a new idea that I was putting forward, but if you don't appropriate the money for 2 years for whatever reasons, and you lose 2 years worth of momentum in your economic development projects, or you have a fight over, what the priorities should be. All I was simply saying is, guys, get together, do a 5-year capital improvement plan. Tell me where you want to spend the money, then park the whole money in MDA's bank account. Let me execute it. And I think we do that for the airport improvement program in the state. We do it for, and we got revolving loan funds here. We do it for ag loans. We do this all over the state and mobilize capital quickly and effectively to address the large scale needs of the region. This exists. And so my recommendations were fully consistent with the law. And it was just an opportunity to have a discussion we haven't had in a while about how do we do this better so that places like Pearl River Community College don't have to have a Hunger Games approach to getting their funding done, or this tech park at Ignition Park, or Bill Lavers, who's building a 1,000-acre industrial park now north of I-10. He's struggling to try to get the water, sewer, all that stuff in there. I mean, if these are priorities for the coast, or if it's a community development project, you want to do downtown redevelopment everywhere, then agree to it. Let's get the money deployed and let's go do it. But let's stop having this kind of food fight over small projects, and let's do some transformational big picture things in a very efficient way. Ricky, it's not efficient for hundreds of community leaders to spend a year writing applications and going through a process, then lobbying this advisory board, then lobbying the governor, only to have nothing happen for a couple of years. That's an incredibly wasteful use of time. And that's what's been happening the last couple of years. We got to stop that.
Well, if you look at the regional organization just formed in the Lafayette County area of Mississippi, or if you think about the Golden Triangle and what they did, my point on there needs to be a regional organization of some sort, because how do you deal with implementation just hinged on voluntary buy-in? There has to be some way to bring people together so we can decide as a group what those priorities are, and then a plan emanates from that. And the people who need to be at the table need to be a cross section of our economy. And I agree with you. I'm a former CEO. I can't imagine making strategic decisions without the benefit of a plan that helps me decide where that needs to be. Let's take Bill Lavers, for example. 1,000-acre site. I mean, that could be really beneficial to coastal Mississippi. It could be really beneficial. Actually, 1,000-acre site in Harrison County, north of I-10, could be really beneficial to Jackson County. It could be really beneficial to Stone County. It could be really beneficial to Pearl River County and Hancock County. So at some point, we all got to get together on this. And we've got the Harrison County Development Commission moving in that direction. They want to do this. And what we've learned from other site development work that's been done across the state of Mississippi, when you're aligned around it, you can pull the money faster. Isn't one of the problems, Bill, that this money has been doled out? The Gulf Coast Restoration Fund money has been doled out in such a way that it's never the complete pot of money that's needed. It's partial funding.
Well,
and we never
let me
really,
give you a very
Yeah.
let me give you a very specific example. And one of the reasons that provoked the response this year was that for the first time, the Gulf Coast Restoration Fund Advisory Committee put a slate of 16 projects together, but for the first time, they didn't fully fund the requests so they could get more projects on the list. Now, I understand the logic there, but if you are an applicant for that grant program and you have not been fully funded what you need to build your project, what are you going to do when you're short $1 million or $2 million? How are you going to make up that money? That sends everybody back to the drawing board scrambling to figure out how to fill the gaps. We have a number of programs up here that are appropriated fund programs by the legislature that are not moving forward because for years, I've got a 2021 GCRF project right now that I just signed a grant application for yesterday because they finally got their money together. I mean, that money's been obligated but not working for almost 5 years. So we need to get things done, Ricky. We need to, if we're going to do these projects, they need to be fully funded across a broad domain. And what the governor's asking me to do is saying, look, Bill, I'll spend some of my restore money to match this GCRF money, but let's get it done. Let's get the project done so that the community can benefit from it. It makes no sense for everybody to get a taste, but too many people not getting their projects done. So that's one element. And I will tell you, I think the solution that I talk about in my letter is a master plan. I don't want to, this is not a plan that would sit on a shelf. This is a plan that picks winners and losers. It says, we're going to invest in Bill Lavers', for example, his industrial park. We're going to invest in the 200 acres on the West Dock that need to be extended at Gulfport. We're going to build hangars at the 3 airports down there because we need hangars for aerospace. We're going to improve Singing River Island in Jackson County, or their other industrial parks on dock down there so that we can either attract new shipbuilders or new logistics options. I want the local community to get what they want. I'm not here to tell them how to do it, but I'm just saying, if we're going to do it, let's get it done. Let's fund it, because this is a very inefficient way of getting things done. And that's when I say master plan, what I mean is give Tate Reeves and Bill Cork a list of your priorities with a schedule that says, we want this from GCRF, we want this from Restore, this from Go Mesa, this from Tidelands, this from site development, so that if we all decide that's what we want to do, the projects get done and we move on to next year's money.
And I'm saying it seems so obvious to me that you can't have the list like that if you don't have the key players at the table. The stakeholders have to be at the table. And one of the things I've noticed is that too many times in economic development conversations take place in coastal Mississippi, and the port's not part of the conversation the way they need to. Or maybe one of the airports is not part of the conversation the way they need to be. And on and on and on. I mean, there's so many different players. I've heard from so many people, Bill. I mean, when I started writing about this at the beginning of this year, didn't hear a lot of feedback. Listen, we were able to look at the metrics on the stories. I mean, we could see that a lot of people were reading them, but a lot of people weren't saying much. But the more I wrote, the more they said. I started hearing from people. This latest column, I've heard from more people on this last column than I've heard from all the other columns combined. People are listening. They're thinking about this. And I have learned from my conversations with so many people in the economic development community that not all parties are at the table at the beginning of the conversations the way we need to be at the table. We will never be able to prioritize regionally anything if we don't have the key players at the table. And that's why I believe something statutorily created is necessary, whether it's in a GCRF 2.0 or whether it's some new legislation, just clean legislation saying this is the organization and this is how we're going to fund it. When we come back on the other side, we'll pick it up from right there. I want to talk about shipbuilding for a little bit too, because that's, see something happen in the other states is something we better pay attention to. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. What a great show today. What an important show to talk about the future of coastal Mississippi with the Executive Director for the Mississippi Development Authority, Bill Cork. Bill, real quick, I've mentioned it many times. After Katrina, we saw what we can do when we come together. I've talked about an alliance. I almost stopped talking about it, to be honest with you, so I could keep a lot more focus on the why. Why do we need to do something and let other people work through that? Because as we've seen many times, coastal Mississippi is resistant to change unless the storm is right in front of us. Katrina hit, we came together. Well, in a lot of ways, I said what we're facing now is kind of like Katrina when you think about AI and all this other stuff that's happening. So we got to come together in some way. But how do we best get to regional priorities, in your view?
Well, it's a great question. And, I get this question a lot across the state as people want to, they see, I've heard you mention the Golden Triangle many times and Area Development Partnership. And there's now some new partnerships occurring up in Tate, Yellowbush, Panola, that in Lafayette County. They've got a 4-county deal that was legislatively enabled. You just got, I think, the Greenwood LaFleur Chamber married up with one of the other counties in the Delta. So the conversation about regionalization is an ongoing one. I at the state level, I just believe that, we're not going to tell people how to organize for success. That's a local decision that should be decided locally. What I'm begging for through this process is, a document that Governor Reeves can use as a roadmap, both as that shows political unity and and some solidarity around this idea of moving the needle in a transformational way. And that's the debate that should be happening. And that can happen in a variety of different fora. I'm not going to tell you which one it has to be. You need a coalition of the willing that believe this is a problem and that are willing to sit down and work with it. And as long as the governor and I can look at that and sit down with the legislative leadership and fashion a strategy from that, that's all I'm looking for. So we're here to grade the paper, not tell you how to do your homework. And I think that's the fair way. And that's the governor's strategy. I think he was very clear about that. The other thing the governor's been very clear about with me is we are going to spend 100% of this recovery money on the coast. It's not going to, that's the governor's commitment. But I worry sometimes, especially in this very interesting political climate we find ourselves in Jackson, is that if the coast doesn't get behind some big transformational projects and try to use this for individual projects, I think there's a very real threat that other legislators around the state are going to be going, why can't I get my air conditioner at my city hall fixed? Or why can't I get my water or sewer line project? And that becomes an open question about where those priorities around the state come in. And so I think it's really incumbent upon the coast to pick a few big winning transformational projects, spend the rest of this money trying to get some of that done. There's always room to do the community development projects. You can carve up a sliver for that, fund the penguins at the aquarium and all the things that need to be done. But, if you don't walk away after spending $750 million without moving the needle for your region, that's got to be deemed a failure. And the governor's use of our site development grant program is a model for how you can approach this with really very limited resources in the grand scheme of things. I think we spent about $100 million of state appropriated money, which the legislature has been very supportive of, but we've targeted it in 30 sites around the state. And every single one of those sites is either winning projects or has a bunch of big transformational projects stacked on top of them. We need more of that product on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And we need more of a regional sales pitch around the value proposition for the coast in the same way that the Community Development Foundation has in Northeast Mississippi, the Golden Triangle, ADP, because companies, when they come to Mississippi, don't see our arbitrary political boundaries. They don't know our internal scuffles, okay? What they see is a coastal area that's pregnant with possibility. And how do you describe that in the most favorable way without going back to a Hunger Games style approach to selling that company?
That's the key. And that's why I view what you did as a favor to coastal Mississippi. It's you can, some may say kick in the shin. I can't see that at all unless you're trying to protect the status quo. And some hopefully will see that this was a wake-up call, which it really is. I mean, the opportunities for us going forward are very dramatic, but we've got to get organized and we've got to have, we've got to understand what our priorities are going to be. And we've got to deal with some of our demons to do it. Every community has to do that. There's nothing unique about that. I've been in New Orleans and Mobile, Huntsville. Good Lord, I did a whole show on Huntsville recently. What Huntsville has done just in the past 10 years has been unbelievable. We can do that here. We should do that here because we've got the ports. We've got rail. We've got interstate. We're centrally located in America. And we've got money. We got money that can help us make these things happen. It's a tremendous opportunity, isn't it, Bill?
Ricky, the Greater Jackson Partnership here in the metro area. I mean, that's sort of a regional overlay, but you don't have a huge regional bureaucracy up here. And both you just had a $3 billion project announced in Warren County, 10 billions up in Madison, and Rankin County is hitting it on all cylinders. They got a data center over there, and stay tuned for Hines. It's coming. Okay, big pipeline. But they got themselves aligned. They tell a regional story. It's an easy place, one-stop shop for MDA to come when we bring projects. And yet every fiefdom still operates very effectively in protecting their own interests. But when it's time to come together, they all come together and they work well together, and they're crushing it. So, I just my admonition to the coast is, guys, this is what it takes to win. If you want to win big, it's a simple concept.
You said it as good as I've ever written it, for sure. It was beautifully said. Thank you, Bill Cork, for spending some time with me, my friend.
Appreciate you, Ricky. Thank you.
You bet. Bill Cork from the Mississippi Development Authority. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.